I'm Mishal Husain from the BBC. It's really nice to have a full house tonight. Thank you all for being here. Welcome back if you're a regular at the Frontline Club, which I consider one of my very favourite places in London. There have been a whole series of events here on this theme of what's happening in the Arab world, the Middle East and North Africa. Clearly, it's been a remarkable few weeks in newsrooms everywhere and a remarkable few weeks to be a journalist. I was lucky enough to witness some of what was happening in Cairo for the BBC, but clearly Libya is the urgent issue at the moment, and I suspect we'll spend most of the next 90 minutes focusing on Libya, for which your panel are very well qualified to answer your questions. I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves and to give us an opening thought on what we're seeing in Libya at the moment, and then it'll be over to you and your questions, and we shall end at 8:30. So thank you again for being here, and I'm going to start with David.
Yes, well, I am David Holt from the London School of Economics. I have been in a media storm, in case you don't know, over the last 10 days. I have explained several times that I'm not in the oil business. I am not in the arms business. I'm not in the money business. I'm just in the ideas business. But even in the ideas business, you can find yourself in very complex debates and intensive discussions. My engagement with Libya started by accident. A young man, as he was then, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, knocked on my door at the London School of Economics and said he was interested in aspects of British idealism. And could I explain what he should read and what he should look for? In the 3 to 4 years that followed that, I saw him every 2 to 3 months, sometimes more frequently, and we discussed over time a range of liberal and democratic ideas which became central to his thesis. On the basis of that, I had a discussion with him which brought me to Libya on a very few occasions, and to subsequently work with a foundation he chaired, which had an impressive and growing reputation for actually promoting human rights, creating space for democratic reform, and pushing an agenda of democracy. It was on that basis that I engaged in a dialogue with him to create a bridge with reformers and dissidents in his country, to create an opportunity for Libyan academics to come to the LSE, to create an opportunity for young Libyans to come to LSE summer school, and to pursue, as it were, a program of research, the ultimate purpose of which was to build a virtual democracy center for North Africa and the Middle East. Of course, this project has been overwhelmed by events. The person I thought I knew became, on the 20th of December, not just a caricature of himself, but the son of his father, completely and absolutely. His speech was not just a shock for me, but an abomination. It didn't so much matter that it was a shock for me, but it was an absolute betrayal of everything he had previously claimed he stood for. And as such, it had disastrous consequences for himself, which is not so important, but much more importantly for his country.
Thank you very much, David Held. Marwan.
Okay. So I'm Marwan Bishara, senior political analyst for Al Jazeera and host of one of its flagship shows. It's called Empire. Now, previously was a history. Previously I was history. I was a professor of international relations at the American University in Paris. But living in Al Jazeera the last few years was quite an experience because, as you all know, notwithstanding the competition, of course.
I have to say, this is, I think, very much the moment, really, of the Arab Channel, so I will definitely grant you that.
I'll accept that. We've, of course, had our ears to the street for the last 15 years. And because we did, perhaps the Arab world has been and is our front yard and our backyard. That for us at Al Jazeera, the Arabs were not invisible, as apparently they have been for most of the media, most of the decision makers in the West in general, in Europe, where the region has been seen through either the prisms of oil, the prisms of Islamic fundamentalism, or Islam, radical Islam, and so on and so forth, the prisms of terrorism and counterterrorism, the prisms of Israel and the Arab-Israeli conflict. But the Arabs have been invisible for so many years. Those very same Arabs that have had a forum in Al Jazeera, and they were reported in Al Jazeera, and they had their voices heard at Al Jazeera. So in a sense, the way we kept up with that world, the Arab world, I think gives us a bit of a window, not only into what's happening in each and every country, which is interesting, and there's a certain specificity, and that I'm sure will be discussed tonight, the specificity of Libya. But is it a coincidence that what happened in Libya happened after Tunisia and Egypt? Or what is happening today in Bahrain and Yemen? So as much as there is something very specific to each one of these countries, in the way it's built up, the way its economy works, and so on and so forth, whether it's tribal or how tribal, religious or not religious, but those countries share something, and that is the visible Arab that has been invisible in Western media. So now you go on around London circuit, and you'll find huge number of terroristologists, and Islamologists, an expert on the Middle East through Israel. And of course you'll find your oil experts, but how many people really know modern Arab world? Probably hardly any.
Okay, Marwan, thank you very much. We're going to talk in depth, but I want to get Noman to introduce himself next.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Noman Benotman. I'm Libyan, based in UK, and British citizen as well. I did serve with the Mujahideen during the Soviet invasion to Afghanistan, like 2 decades ago. Then I helped to set up the LIFG, Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which is like fought against Colonel Gaddafi maybe for about 15 years, and we failed at the time to get rid of him. 2007, I involved with the Saif al-Islam, Colonel Gaddafi's son, in process called like reconciliation. We managed to de-radicalize the LIFG, Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, and one of the positive outcomes, the release of like hundreds and hundreds of prisoners. And we managed to de-radicalize, I think, the entire religious sphere of Libya. And the expert at the time, it was like a model for many countries as well. And I engaged with the reform process itself, like other aspects had to do with Libya. And now I think we're back to square one because of the war situation in Libya. I don't know how it's going to end up, but I'm sure it's not going to be like a happy end. And now I'm working with Quilliam Foundation. It's a think tank in London as senior analyst. Thank you.
Thank you. And actually, you were just back from Libya just a few days ago. So you saw.
Yeah, I was in Libya. I back like 9 days ago.
Thank you, Richard.
I'm Richard Dalton. I was British ambassador in Libya from 1999 to 2002. I must be the civil servant here because I'm the only person bar one wearing a tie. After that I went to Tehran, and I've been an associate fellow Middle East program at Chatham House for the last 3 years. Libya is poised between at least 4 possible scenarios, and you're a brave person if you're prepared now to choose which. I don't exclude a happy ending in the sense of a pluralist Libya that moves towards the kinds of standards we would all wish its people to enjoy. But I fear, like so many others, that the way there is going to be dreadfully hard. I think the scenarios are first that Libyan fighting continues, in effect a stalemate, skirmishes here, skirmishes there, nobody able to get a handle on the other. Secondly, that Gaddafi's support actually continues to crumble, and once the barrier of fear is removed, a sufficiently large number of people get out in the street, as happened in Tunisia and Egypt and elsewhere to actually seriously affect the calculations of the population in the capital, Tripoli, and the remaining loyal, those people are loyal to Gaddafi. I think the third scenario is some form of internal coup in which those who are close to Gaddafi consider that their best hope of surviving and having a future is to move aside the most damaging element of the present setup, namely the Gaddafi family. And the fourth scenario is a deepening disorder, civil breakdown. So that's as far as I can get in thinking about a forecast. As of today, the situation is changing from day to day.
I think it's fair to say that this was a particularly ominous day as we look back of 2 weeks of protest, because it was the first day that there really was a sense of being in a military phase with the sense of territory being taken and retaken. I just wonder whether, before we open questions to the floor, I could just ask you instinctively, each of you, instinctively, if you feel that this is the end for Colonel Gaddafi. David?
Well, I hope it's the end for Colonel Gaddafi. I think there's sort of broadly two scenarios, but we can discuss that as the evening goes on. One is the country is bifurcated between East and West, very much the stalemate you suggested, where each side bloodies the other from time to time. And the other one is one of the slow leakage of Gaddafi's power, which eventually leads to its complete rupture. Different days suggest different things about these two scenarios. My own view is, if the West acts reasonably decisively, if we can find some use for these Baroque armies we spend billions and hundreds of billions on, by creating perhaps a no-fly zone, by perhaps even being more interventionist, knocking out his arms, ammunition dumps, and maybe even some of his military equipment, then that could be a stimulus to the weakening of the regime. I think there are options here, and there is a responsibility now in Europe and elsewhere to hasten the end of this brutal regime.
Noman, do you feel instinctively it's the end?
Yeah, I'm strongly believe this is the end of Colonel Gaddafi's regime and himself as individual. But for me, it's not like the end is not. It's when. This is the most important question now, because I don't. It's not now. A couple of weeks ago, I was certain like he's gonna last for a long time. So we need to start to think about months, at least. Talking about like days or weeks, I think it's unrealistic, because he managed successfully and deliberately to transform it from a peaceful uprising against his regime to be a war situation. He was very successful in these tactics, and I would like to emphasize here, he is successfully as well immediately switched from the mood of the leader or as like a king or president, whatever you're going to label him, to be a guerrilla warfare leader, and it's very dangerous. So this is the mood now that Colonel Gaddafi is operating.
And he's actually very comfortable in that role.
He's very comfortable, and he was ready for this. And we should focus as well, because it's war, We can't talk about just like the people protesting outside in the streets. Just if you see or if you follow the protests, since it starts on the 17th of February until today, every day you will see the scene being militarized, increasing of the militarization of the situation. Now, every day we start to see even the protesters or the revolutionaries themselves, the people liberating their own cities, everybody start to have his own gun. So there's a lot of guns out there. This situation, I believe, it will help Colonel Gaddafi's force to remain for I think, long time, and then from there he hope to start to negotiate with the West, not with his own people, to secure something for the future.
So actually, Richard Dalton, does that mean that actually, compared to a couple of days ago, actually his position is stronger than it was Colonel Gaddafi's own position?
I'm not prepared to say that. I would also like to just take some of the emphasis away from the West. The United Nations is an awful lot more than the West, and the West, in any case, doesn't always act coherently. And above all, it does not have the kind of unity of view on a huge, and I think inaccurate generalization that we heard from Marwan. I mean, Arabs have not been invisible in the way he suggests, as seen from my side of the fence, but I can see how you would appreciate that differently from your side.
Marwan.
I do warn against Western intervention. We've seen Western interventions in Iraq and Somalia and Afghanistan. I don't think it bodes well. And I don't think an intervention, military intervention in Libya will help. I think it will end up escalating the situation. Judging from what I know about the Libyans, they were probably as hardcore as the Iraqis and Afghanis in resisting any presence of Americans there.
Sure.
Having said that, I don't think the way back is the way forward in Libya. So certainly Gaddafi is on his way out. Whether they're going to give him a safe passage to join his friend Mugabe remains to be seen. I think he probably insists on staying and fighting it out. The army is breaking away from him. That's the good news. The tribes are breaking away from him. That's even better news. His diplomats are breaking away from him. That's the third good news. So in fact,
That's the easiest, though. I mean, the one for those outside Libya, that's the easiest break to make, isn't
well,
it?
actually, even internally, for example, his interior minister has left, and so on and so forth. He has a trinity of legitimacy: tribal, army, and civilian, leaders of some sort. And they are leaving him slowly but surely. What is left with him are the militias, and the militias, he and his sons have armed very well, and they're the ones who are doing the dirty job for him. But I don't think they have future in Libya.
Thank you very much. If you could raise your hands if you have a question. We have a couple of microphones around them. Can we get the microphones to the back of the room there? Just while the microphones come to you, can I remind you, please, to say who you are. This is being streamed live on the Frontline website and filmed by C-SPAN. And if you're tweeting about it, then it's #Frontline Club.
Yeah, I work with...
Sorry, your name?
Unni Krishnan. I work with Plan International, humanitarian agency. What's your take on the humanitarian fallout of this violence?
Can I ask you to just hold the microphone a bit closer?
Yeah. What's your take on the humanitarian fallout of the violence, as well as a potential fallout if sanctions are put in place? Please remember that in Iraq, nearly 750,000 children died during the sanction period when Saddam Hussein continued to remain in place. So your take on both the humanitarian fallout from the violence as well as if sanctions are put in place.
Thank you. Who'd like to start? No, Noman, what is your fear of what the humanitarian impact would be from sanctions, or indeed just from ongoing violence?
Honestly, to be honest with you, I don't think there's anyone like to advocate for like sanctions affecting the people. No, I don't think. Now all the debate, it's about like no-fly zone, and it's still the issue itself. It's highly debatable, but because it's not just you're going to ask Gaddafi kindly, oh please, would you mind don't fly your MiG, or Siho, So it's not like this, because you need to launch like surgical attacks against certain Libyan defense, anti-craft missiles. So the issue itself is very highly debatable. And just I would like to add something about this. What's the real capacity for Gaddafi Air Force? I know I think now they are less than 15 or 20%, if I'm optimistic, the Libyan Air Force capacity. Because since the problem starts, one of the major European countries, they withdraw all their technical staff. So one of the major like airplanes, they can't fly anymore. It's a fact, I know that. And they still struggling with other, like even the Russians make. They have a lot of problems in terms of technical stuff. So it's the idea itself about no-fly zone. Maybe it's going to create like counterproductive rather to help the Libyans. But I know it's in terms of like a conflict like this start every day to be like a international conflict. Maybe it will send like a crystal clear signal to Colonel Gaddafi, like to force him to behave. But just regarding the humanitarian issue, I think it was planned, a couple of weeks ago. There's a huge lack of food supply, especially in the eastern part of the country, and even like western cities as well. And I believe it was planned, to create, as I told you, a war situation or a civil war situation. And now a lot of countries, including Qatar, I think now the major, I believe, country involved in like supplying food and medicine, a lot of stuff. And I would like to mention something here. The Libyans, they are very proud, themselves. We never ever been in this situation, We used to see it in the news. But now Libyans themselves to start to be like a recipient of aid and medicine, it's really, really, it's very painful. Myself, I can feel it, It's very painful, but I think this is the situation. It's the Libyans are in need for the international aid, unfortunately to say that.
Richard Alton, are you in favour of a no-fly zone, the idea of imposing a no-fly zone?
under certain conditions. First, it has to have legitimacy. You could get legitimacy from a United Nations Security Council resolution, or if that was not going to pass, you could, as in other humanitarian interventions, obtain legitimacy through regional consultation and through the receipt, although it wouldn't be anything formal, of a sense or a request that the Libyans under pressure inside Libya want intervention.
But it cannot be a British-American effort. That would be wrong in your
It would make much more sense if it was a Spanish-Italian effort, because they are in the front line of this issue. It's their oil supplies, for example, that's at greatest risk, and it's their immigration problem rather more than the UK. Maybe the US and the UK could play a part, but I think people who advocate armed humanitarian intervention need to think quite widely about the kind of coalition that would be put together.
Okay. I know there's another. Yes, you had a question at the back.
My name is Mariam, and I'm a postgraduate student at the School of Oriental and African Studies. My question is to Mr. Marwan. I mean, I'm studying media, and I've been very much following what's been happening in the past month, being from the Middle East myself as well, and of course, because it's very interesting. And my question is, and something that I've been thinking about, is the definition of how Al Jazeera is redefining the professionalism, so to say, the Western ethics of journalism, and I put Western between two quotations. I wanted to know your opinion about how Al Jazeera is kind of playing with the idea of distance, the emotional distance. It's not like any other channel. When you watch specifically the news about Egypt and Libya and Tunisia, you feel like you are having a conversation with people that are sitting within your private sphere, rather than you are being the recipient of news. And I think Al Jazeera has actually redefined the concept of coverage in the last events. And the other question is, what do you think about the exclusion of Al Jazeera from the exclusive interview that Al-Qaddafi gave to ABC, CNN, and NBC, I believe? Thank you.
ABC, BBC, and the Sunday Times. Thank you. My bosses may be watching this. Marwan.
Well, I'm not going to take too long, just because the subject matter is Libya, and I don't want to seem like I'm promoting Al Jazeera here, or defending it, or explaining it. But let's just put it that way. We did pride ourselves for a long time for being the voice of the South, so-called, and for being the voice of the people. We actually have an hour program where just people phone in and just speak endlessly in the morning, in the evening, and so on and so forth. Has there been an emotional moment? Of course there have been an emotional moment, especially for Al Jazeera Arabic. Imagine this would be French television after the Second World War, or British television after the Second World War. This is probably the biggest moment in recent history in this region.
Yes.
Imagine someone like Gaddafi been ruling for 40-some years. A third generation of Libyans have lived under him. So yes, for young journalists, for young people in the Arab world, for a young channel like Al Jazeera, having this all, or living or being in the midst of all of this, of course it counts for something. But did they keep a certain distance? Yes, I think they did. In a sense, until today, leaders in the Arab world would come to speak to Al Jazeera. But even before this whole thing started, as many of you probably might know, we were banned in Kuwait, we were banned in Morocco, we had a big fallout in Egypt, and now we are banned in Libya. So this is, of course, a certificate of good behavior. When you're banned from dictators, you must be doing the right thing.
I think the final bit of your question was about the exclusion of Al Jazeera. I mean, that was I mean, obviously none of us know the inner workings of Colonel Gaddafi's mind, but the fact that Al Jazeera was already banned precluded being part of that.
It was
interview,
banned. We actually had one Libyan official come on Al Jazeera, very hot-headed, and said something about, we will let you come in only if you start behaving. And when they were asked, what do you mean by behaving? They said, when you start being a good journalist. And he said, so you're actually not giving us a good testimony, certificate of good behavior. And they said, no. He said, all the media outlets in the world are good, except Al Jazeera is bad. They said, yes, Al Jazeera is bad. Until you behave, we will let you in. I think they're behaving like the rest. Ali Abdullah Saleh has blamed the services in Yemen on Israel and Al Jazeera. So
Thank you. If you could keep raising your hands, I can try and get microphones in advance. Lady over here, and anyone, and then we'll go to the gentleman there. Thank you.
Hi, sorry, I'm Zoe from City University, postgrad journalism. It's sorry to bring it back to the West, and when I talk about the West, in this case, I'm meaning primarily Britain and the States. And it seems that from an Arab perspective, and from the perspective of many in the West, that the West's relations in the Middle East have been defined by self-interest and hypocrisy, mostly over the last decades. And I'm wondering what you think the sort of policy that Britain and other states could adopt now towards Libya, and specifically the other uprisings, that might redeem its kind of behaviour, or sort of morally rectify, if possible, its relations with the Middle East.
And you're looking for a sort of single, coherent approach to the region.
Intervention of any form, or sort of on the part of Britain or the states, not necessarily a unified kind of approach.
David.
Well, I profoundly agree with your question. I mean, the relationship between the United States and Europeans, big powers, and Middle East has generally been a movement between, on the one hand, the provision of red carpets to Middle Eastern leaders, and on the other hand, when things go disastrously wrong, carpet bombing. So there's been this absolute shift and incoherence, I think, in Middle East policy. On the one hand, seeking to pursue political and geoeconomic advantage when it suits, and on the other hand, at an arbitrary point in time, not necessarily a consistent point in time, suddenly saying this is the crucial test. I think the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, of course, have backfired. The war on terror has caused great damage, not just of course to the countries that were at the heart of those wars, but to the West in the eyes of the young Arab populations. One of the things to me that is different between 1989 and this extraordinary Arab uprising now was in 1989 the peaceful movements had a common purpose and a common goal, which was to embrace the West. They wanted Western democracies, they wanted higher consumption standards, they wanted markets. The image of the West now in this extraordinary Arab Spring, as it has been called, is much more tainted. It's been tainted exactly for the reasons that you said. So where
They do want similar things to what was wanted in Eastern Europe. I mean, perhaps it's not overall articulated as clearly, and it's not as organised.
The only point I'm trying, yes, I mean, absolutely, I agree with you. However, because the war on terror has had such negative consequences for the reception of the West, I think it's made the political demands that are emerging now from young people and other groups are more mixed, and their direction is not always entirely clear. Whereas, of course, these incredible and remarkable movements of people to bring down autocratic regimes is one thing. To turn those, of course, into consolidated democracies is another, which brings me to your very important question. What can the West do now? Well, it seems to me the one thing the West can do now is to respect the self-determination of Arab peoples, to listen to their voice, to engage more in dialogue, and if and when they intervene, and if and when they wish to support these Arab movements, they build up the infrastructure of the autonomy of these movements, their capacities for self-determination, rather than, in other words, bottom-up politics, rather than do deals in the old style to suit interests at the level of autocratic states.
Richard Dalton, obviously you know exactly what it's like to be part of British foreign policy in this region. So would you accept mistakes have been made? There hasn't been a coherent approach, a consistent approach.
Well, if mistakes have been made, they've been supported by the democratic system of the United Kingdom. And the point I would like to start from is that, yes, states act in accordance with their self-interest. That's international politics 101. And you wouldn't expect Egypt to behave any differently, or Brazil to behave any differently, or the United Kingdom to behave any differently. Second, British people have a right to jobs. British people have a right to the attempt to influence on human rights and their democratic values. British people have a right to security. So when you frame, as a foreign policy person, the objectives for your foreign policy, you frame it in accordance with that which the British people want and express through their parliamentary representatives, and in turn through the selection of their governments. This has always been the case. It was in the case when we were working with the Soviet Union to sell things to the Soviet Union, to export our culture to the Soviet Union, to discuss the future of the region through the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. engagement differs from region to region and country to country, but those principles are eternal. Now, the next point to emphasize is that if you're trying to achieve certain objectives, like security, like jobs, you can't expect to be able to insult and demean and oppose the government you're working with in other matters. And inevitably, when a foreign country wants to work with us, we as the UK set the terms. And the same is true in international relations when you want to achieve your objectives with another country. So, what you try and do is maintain a balance so that you advance on a broad front. Now, the instruments we chose to assist in the extension of civil and political and human rights to Arab peoples, while at the same time trying to pursue the national interests of the British people, was, one, the action programs under the European Neighbourhood Policy study very carefully the conditionality on the extension of trade privileges that the European Union encapsulates in those agreements, the dialogue on good governance and human rights, and secondly, bilateral programs of assistance to civil society.
Rich, can I just ask you, because let's just make this specific to Libya. At the time that you were the British ambassador in Tripoli, which was the same time that Tony Blair's government was carrying out this big rapprochement, did you have doubts as you looked around you and thought, well, you know, we're making all these advances in our relationship with Libya, but this is still an absolute regime, this is still a police state, there's still not going to be an election here or anything even close to an election?
And that, yes, indeed, as did my colleague, the ambassador in Moscow, as he watched the deterioration of public life and democracy in Moscow. Clearly there are degrees in these things. I'm not trying to say that all international villains are on the same
it was different
level.
Because there was a conscious
but the fact
decision
is,
to
if you wish
change
to
the
pursue
relationship with
the
Gaddafi.
consensus in our country about the advancement of people's interests and national interests, you have to accept that you can't pick and choose your partners, and you can't force them to change so they fit into our mould.
Okay, Marwan, I think you wanted to say something on that, and then I'll go back to you, Sarah, and to the question over there.
I just came back from Washington this morning, and throughout our discussions about Libya, I tried to distinguish between Washington and the rest of America, and I think there's room to distinguish between London and the rest of the UK. And I mean by London, the machinization of the politics, the special interests, the lobbying, and so on and so forth. The arms lobbies, the oil lobbies, the likes. No, I think it's a cop-out, Mr. Ambassador, to say we work according to national interests and that's it. That's not how a democracy functions. Democracy has values, they have principles. The people decide that they don't want to deal with someone who is oppressing his people, killing his people for the last 40 years. That's what a democracy does.
The point you were making is that the British people didn't rise up in the streets and say, why are we dealing with Colonel Gaddafi?
Was right.
The British people didn't know how Tony Blair was sitting in a tent making deals in the dark with Colonel Gaddafi about what's next and about the contracts to be given to the UK, just like America did, just like other cynics do, the French and so on and so forth. And I don't mean the French as the French people, I mean Paris. So I, as a journalist, as a human being, as a citizen, what is it we probe our governments then on? Why the BBC exists and our media outlets? To put you folks in power, probe you, whether you represent the interest and the principle and the values of the people. Sometimes you do, mostly you don't. In this case of Libya, the last 70 years, it's a cap-out. You need some serious soul-searching on the question of the relationship with Libya. This was a thug of a regime. You did business with them, knowing what they were doing. I think we need to look at it.
I think regarding what's going on now in Libya and even I think in Egypt and Tunisia, maybe the rest of the Middle East, myself, and I don't know, I believe everybody I spoke with, they believe it's undermining the Arabs themselves as countries or as ethnic group, whatever you're going to classify them, to start to talk about their own destiny within the context, okay, what's the opinion of the UK or Washington or even the West? I think this approach, it's completely wrong. And I believe all the Arabs, including myself, we don't like to discuss the issues from this approach or perspective. And I strongly believe I cannot blame, the UK or any other European country about why I don't have a democratic system in my country like Libya or any other Arab countries, because I strongly believe they can't create it themselves. But if you start yourself, and this is what's going on now, the people, when they fed up and they go out on the streets, I'm always call it's 100% transparent referendum. This is what the people they want outside. Not al-Qaeda, not a political group behind it, not any ideological group. This is the people of the Middle East, one country after another. They are protesting outside the streets, and they start to ask for democracy, modern political system. So what's the role here for the West? Because they start to see what's going on there. This is what the people they want. This is what the Libyans they want. I think, many Western countries, they can help what's the Libyans they want. So they can help them, they can support them to justify or really to make us believe, these countries or these societies, they stand for the democratic values they believe in. This is, I think, the most important thing. But practically, to be honest with you, I know exactly how these things works, I think it's, maybe because myself, I'm not academic. I'm a very practical person, I spent 25 years of my life very practical on the field.
I think some academics could be practical too.
No, I am very practical.
Okay.
So, no one can just go appears in front of people and start to talk about very sensitive issues. But I would like to make it clear like this: what's going on now in the Middle East, I think, creates one heck of vacuum. Excuse my language. In many Western capitals. Why? Because they start to see other leaders. They have no profile for them. Other, if I may say, groups, non-political parties, they are on the ground there, and they are reclaiming the states, which they used to deal business with. We don't need to fool ourselves. There's no country on earth can just accept this and just goes, okay, we'd like to help you to establish your democratic system, and we will support you in terms of human rights or whatever. It doesn't work like this. Believe me, it doesn't work like this. First of all, it's always what's for me on the table. Because if there's any other foreign country, why should I help you? Why should I take the risk?
Okay.
Especially in this time. So this is what I'm trying to say. I think it's a very critical moment, but I still believe it's a very good opportunity for the West.
But it's an opportunity for the Libyans.
And the Libyans, and it's Libya, it's very sensitive area. You know why? I'm not gonna explain this situation maybe later on if there's other questions, but just the area there, it's part of Europe because this is the southern part of the Mediterranean.
Okay, thank you, Noman. I'm going to take the gentleman with the question there and then come to you.
Thank you. My name's Peter Bale. Is there any possibility that the toppling of Saddam and the creation of a democratic Iraq has actually positively contributed to these series of revolutions and perhaps even Libya?
Who'd like to start with?
That's a great question, Mike.
I wonder how many people are viewing intervention in Iraq differently.
I actually think what's happening today happened despite, not thanks to.
Yes.
Meaning, we were passing sort of around November last year, I think the darkest moment in our region. Most of it part of the domino effect from the war in Iraq. Meaning, I've never seen the region so divided, so burdened with tension, with such pent-up violence. I remember I listed nine cases for Al Jazeera in preparing what I called the hot winter coming up in an internal memo. But the youth of the Arab world surprised us, being far more mature than all the rest. And what they've done, they've raised two issues. One is, democracy is possible without tanks and airplanes and invasions and the death of 1 million Iraqis by one way or another, or one form or another. The democracy is possible because democracy is the business of the people, by the people, and for the people, not on the back of a tank. I think that was the message, that we don't want to go Iraq's way, that there is a possible alternative. What's happening, it's of course a work in progress. In Egypt and Tunisia, hopefully in Morocco, Yemen, Bahrain, and so on and so forth, is a stark comparison with what happened or what is happening in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think the Arabs have proven that George Bush was wrong, that Tony Blair was wrong, that you could create a situation peacefully almost, where freedom, the Arabs, by the way, don't like to call it democracy in the sense of the liberal sense of the today, because I don't think it's achievable that. They call it justice. Freedom and justice is possible today without more tanks.
David, and then I'll come to you, Richard.
Yeah, I think there are very few historical examples of successful creation of democracies from above. If you look at the examples that we have, there are instances, of course, after the Second World War, the reconstruction of Germany and Japan. But these were total wars under conditions of total defeat. In an age of post-imperial power, in an age of decline of empires, in an age where human rights and self-determination at the core and spreading across the world, these ideologies do not bow down to the power of imposition. The most extraordinary and the most banal statement I think ever made in contemporary politics was Rumsfeld's shock and awe, that we will shock people and from that they will bow down and consent. What makes these new Arab revolutions so different from that is that these were groundswells from below. Successful revolutions often occur at the intersection of national and international conditions. So here you had this extraordinary pressure on local economies, on Arab economies, rising commodity prices, rising food prices of various kinds, which impacted directly on dire and poor standards of living. At the same time, you have a hugely young population wired together more than ever before with rising expectation. An educational system that semi-worked, that turned down educated people, but educated people driving buses, not there's anything wrong with driving buses, but finding roles and occupations lower than the expectations they had. And this, along with many other factors, produced this groundswell from below. And that, it seems to me, historically creates greater conditions for the success of democracy than anything that the Britain or America could try from above.
Does the end result in Iraq represent something positive, whatever you think of the means of getting there?
Well, I think if you go to war on grounds that are false, if in the process you kill tens of thousands of people and displace hundreds of thousands more, and if you turn an authoritarian regime into a failed state, a fractured failed state, you cannot claim much achievement for yourself, and you should be judged by those promises.
Richard Dalton.
I agree completely with Marwan and David, and I would only add that I think one useful way of looking at what's happening in the Arab countries is to look at the social contract. This helps one to explain why some countries are rather slower to catch on to what's happening than others. In Saudi Arabia, the social contract is still much stronger. It's got religion, it's got deference, it's got a relatively popular king, and it's cemented together with a lot of cash. Where you see the countries that have burst into flame most quickly, it's where the social contract is weakest. In Jordan, it's stronger. I mean, the big mystery is Syria. If anybody here can speak to us about Syria, maybe Marwan can. That would be tremendously helpful.
But just talking on that subject of cash, because it has been very interesting to see, how much has been spent by rulers across this region. Is there a point where, however much money you spend, and clearly Saudi Arabia has a lot of money to spend in this department, it will not be enough?
Oh, absolutely. This is not about money anywhere. It's about grievance, and some of the grievances are about money. Yeah. But the Tunisian revolution, I believe, was fundamentally a political revolution. It was utter disgust, and that gives me the opportunity to say that I think one of the remarkable things is how little ideology there is in these revolutions and how much raw emotion. And that's where the international satellite television broadcasting element comes in, led by Al Jazeera, but a lot of others in there too, because people in the region channel hop like mad. It's about bringing into your living room and into your family discussions the tremendous efforts made by others elsewhere, and the sense of shame you get if you're suffering under the same conditions because you haven't done anything about it. So that's so much more important in galvanizing people than the Twitter aspect or the social networking aspect, which is about communication once something has been got going.
Thank you. Sorry, you've been waiting for a long time.
Craig Dean from Plan International. We've seen in the Middle East that the change is being driven by young people. I'm just wondering what the panel think the young people in the West and across the world can do to support the positive change that we're seeing and hopefully move international relations in to a more positive future.
Okay. Can young people in the West, Noman, do you think, support the positive changes that we're seeing, what the youth of the Arab world are starting to voice?
From a very practical.
Yeah, that's why it's. I think the way how I understand it, it's like we have two levels here. You know, like official governmental help, which is more effective, way more effective, and non-government help. So the youth you talk about in the West, I think they would be part of this like non-government efforts to help what's going on in the Middle East now, like the work of the NGOs or social movements or whatever. But practically as well, I can't see it honestly. You know, now they can deliver unless if they can help to push for like certain policies to be taken by their own governments. With every possible like means and tools available for them, including like going outside, protesting outside on the streets without causing any damage. But this is the only thing. But practically, I think it's still in the Middle East the work of the governments, rather the non-government organization, either groups or NGOs or whatever.
By the way, just for your information, I think they're already helping in a very, very interesting way. The Tunisians and the Egyptians weren't able to break the firewalls that were imposed by the government, but by the help of young Serbs, young Bulgarians, I think also a bunch of French, Americans. A lot of what was going on in the social networks, sometimes when they recreated the tweeting, a lot of young people were actually involved over the last several weeks already, not only in solidarity, in the universities and this and that and other place, but actually in, you know, if bloggers and the new insurgents, certainly the youth around the world have joined the Arab insurgency.
Thank you. Sorry, I think a gentleman there who has a question, and then there are some questions at the front. Thank you. This lady here. I'll come to you after that. Thank you.
It seems only a month ago that a young man called Mohammed committed suicide in Tunisia a month ago, and this set up a whole chain of events which is causing this discussion and the world in its emotive way looking at the whole events in the Middle East. What role do you think the press has in this whole event, and how will it actually develop into reporting events beyond the Middle East?
So you mean the press coverage initially from Tunisia, how that essentially
the knock-on effect of the whole thing, which only happened a month ago?
A little more, December.
Two months ago, 17th of December.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to allow you to speak about the power of the Arab media at Al Jazeera again.
No, I won't.
Seems unfair
I'm
not
not mentioning that even once again. It's actually, you can see it that way. When Mohammed Bouazizi set himself on fire, the idea that the news and some image of him in the hospital went viral on the web. That became part of the social networks. And when the social network got interest, the satellite media, especially the satellite Arab media, got interested. And what started as social networks rooting for social justice became massive demonstrations, spreading through entire cities. It turned into an uprising. That had to be covered then by the rest of the world when Western media and others woke up to it. That became a national uprising. And then it became a revolution when it started spreading to Egypt, to Bahrain, to Yemen. And then no one else could avoid the story. So what started as social networks, rooting for social justice, because I think the Arabs were invisible in Western media, social networks awaken various media outlets to what is going on in the Arab world. It did catch fire, not just the person. The world caught fire and caught up, if you will, with what's going on, putting politicians in the West, notably, but also elsewhere, under the spotlight, that they had to do something, they had to say something, and they start saying things that were not exactly eloquent, or they started hedging in the beginning and so on, but eventually they did catch up because of the press, because the media did catch up. Yes, the BBC, yes, when the CNN folks, as they call them in America, got beaten up in Cairo, whoa, believe me, this was no longer a corporate calculation. journalism became very important engine.
But equally, if you look at Libya, we are not able to tell the same kinds of stories, which, you know, most likely do exist in the same way, because we just don't. No one has that kind of access and that kind of ability to operate. David?
Well, I agree with what you have said, but I would just say this is not just a story of the West, it's also a story of the East. I, with two colleagues, wrote an article called The Arab 1989 and sent it to a variety of newspapers, including China Daily. The op-ed editor accepted it. The next day they turned it down on the ground that Chinese policy is that what was happening then in Egypt was a matter for Egypt alone and not an issue of wider concern and consideration. So I think right across Asia, many of the same points apply. It is not just that the West of all ages has, in a sense, not seen the development and changing dynamics of the Arab world. It has seen it in static terms of autocratic regimes that are stagnant, and the arguments about the stagnant Arab world have been prevalent in academic literature for generations. But while that's true, the East also has had little comprehension of what is now going on, and those that pursue their dominant sectional interests in the area, China and increasingly India.
By the way, China
and so
banned Egypt news.
Yes,
a lot of us in black
exactly. China, but increasingly India. They also fall exactly under the edict that you set out.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, your question. Thank you. I'll come to you in a second.
Okay, I'm Mimma Lehtovaara. I'm a journalist from Finland, currently a Reuters journalist fellow from Oxford. And I will actually go back to the beginning. And what kind of a role does the son of Gaddafi play in this situation at the moment? Is this a sort of a father-son joint venture thing, or who are the most important allies for Mr. Gaddafi at the moment?
I think actually, I mean, David, obviously, I'd like you to answer this first, but actually I think all of you, all four of you, know Saif Gaddafi, so I think we can all talk about this. Go ahead.
Well, we've already had a discussion before we came into the room about this, and you'll be pleased to know there's been a considerable commonality among three of us and quite a different emphasis over here, so you'll get an interesting range of views. I am most struck, of course, now, in light of what has happened, by how much I didn't understand Saif Gaddafi. You know, we talked over years, we engaged in different places, but the thing that struck me about this person is he not just talked the talk, but he was creating a foundation that was actually innovating in Libya and pursuing a human rights agenda in significant ways. And it was only because he didn't just use words to this effect, but had a record of action that I myself was willing to get engaged with him to help develop this program, to create the bridges I spoke about earlier. But it's very clear now that at the moment of crisis, which overwhelmed Libya just as fast as any other of the other countries, he had a choice between father and principle. And in that sense, in the traditions of Shakespeare and Freud, who would have murdered your father? And not many people do.
Was he putting on a front then, or has he changed?
That is the question. I mean, that is a very, very important question. All I can say is I knew a Saif Gaddafi that had a side to him that we haven't seen since the 20th of February. Since the 20th century, we have seen Colonel Gaddafi Mark II. Now, the question is Colonel Gaddafi Mark II always the true colours of this person, or was there something more to it? I think you can't just block out in Soviet style the record. It's not just what he said, it's actually what he was doing through the foundation and so on, and taking risks. One of the last projects that they were pursuing was the creation of a private market for land in Libya. And the reason why this is so important is you can't get entrepreneurial activity in any developing country that begins to gain momentum to create a private sector unless you have secure tenure of land and contract. Now, this is a serious project which was precisely designed to shift power from a monolithic state into the private sector and to free those on. I think there was a sustained project there, so I think history will have to think about this issue, the relationship between before and after. But there are different views on the panel, as you'll see.
Could I just ask, how did you feel when you watched that speech that he gave when he talked about fighting to the last bullet, the last drop of blood?
I was appalled. I mean, I could only describe it as everyone else did at the time, as catastrophic. Catastrophic, not for him, which was in a sense a minor position in history, but catastrophic for Libya. Because he had the moment at that time, as I know, to reach out to the divisions in his country and to offer the possibility of a transitional governance based on new kinds of referenda, which he had talked about before, that might have created the basis for a transition from the Gaddafi regime to a new popular representative government. But at that moment of choice, he failed catastrophically.
Marwan, before I come to you, I'm going to ask Richard Dalton, again someone who's met the Gaddafis. Was he putting on a front? Was he going through the motions before?
No, I think it was genuine. And I think your explanation, or David's, was it that if your father's life is threatened and you have to make a choice, you will do what you do. Most people would. I think there's one point that we should just mention. That speech also contained a promise that there would be a new political dialogue. In other words, he did offer, genuinely or not, we can never tell, the process which, say, the Bahrainis began, namely a dialogue between rulers and people. Those of us watching that speech thought that there was precious little chance of the colonel agreeing to that, and we thought that the Libyan people would regard it as far too little, far too late, and that is indeed what happened.
Can I just add one phrase on that? I mean, the offer of reform in that speech seemed to me entirely uncompelling and implausible. If you are savaged by a beast, a dog, in any shape or form, and then the dog offers afterwards to take you to a Prada shop and to buy you some nice clothes, what does that offer? What does that offer mean? The speech was so violent and abusive and portrayed the protesters as drunkards, as drug-fueled addicts and so on, then the offer of dialogue is just hidden by this language of violence.
So at that point the choice has already been made?
Absolutely.
Noman?
It's a very complicated question to answer, you know. But it's, I'm 100% support the idea since like 2007, or maybe before that, let's say 2005, when he started to act as a political figure within the Libyan scene. I think he took a lot of like very radical actions or moves, which is always faces a lot of like obstacles and objections from not just his father, but the radical hardcore in the Libyan regime. And I know, as a matter of fact, not just because of my like personal contact with him, but other people as well, he, including from his father, they used to label him as someone, his mind being corrupt by liberal values, including his father. He used to they used to label him like this, someone being corrupt with liberal values, because the time he spent outside in Austria and in London. Anyway, as Professor David mentioned, you know, he worked very hard, you know, on the ground, and a lot of people in the West, you know, they know that, they involved with him in many projects. But it's all, we should say, it's a reform plan, but it was still within the context of the Colonel Gaddafi's regime. But he thought at the time it's maybe the safest way, you know, to start to reform the country, and at the same time, don't destroy the structure of power.
Okay, so you believe he was genuine at that time?
Yeah, just I'd like to say, definitely, I believe that.
Okay.
But just I would like to say, what happened on the 17th of February, he decided, that's his decision, and I believe that was a historical decision to, I think, to stand not just with his father. No, I think it's very simple to say his father, you know. But as I saw, it's with the radical hardcore of the Libyan regime, you know. People, they still believe they are revolutionary, they are like freedom fighters or whatever, and they decide we should carry on the fight. It's a conspiracy against Libya. He decided by himself, which I believe 100% wrong, you know. I wish if he'd like maybe decide otherwise, but so now it's his decision, and he switched himself to be a warrior rather reformers.
Okay, Marwan.
Well, let me disagree. 100%. Just for the hell of it, I would have disagreed 80, but I'm going to disagree for the sake of being contrary on this question. Just because actually I'm talking to this audience. I don't know, maybe I would talk the same way to whatever audience I'm talking to. But I think there is something to say when you talk to one of the oldest democracies and one of the most ethical democracies, this country, you know, the United Kingdom. When we talk to people, we don't insult their intelligence on this question. I don't know if you are as cosmopolitan as I am, Have any of you followed Keeping Up with the Kardashians? Well, this was a story of keeping up with the Gaddafians. Sex, lies, and videotapes. And arms. You can add arms. The sons, Saif, is the sexier one. That one is the more violent one, the playboy, the violent, the one who hits the servants, the one that cheats on the money, the one that... We were keeping up with the Gaddafian for the last 7 years. And who the hell are they? Why does this Saif Gaddafi... he doesn't have a single political position. His father fought a revolution, liberated the country, I don't know, his father's buddies, in-laws. Who is he? Why does he run a foundation? Why does he get on a press conference and speak on behalf of Libya?
Well, but because he comes from a part of the world where politics is in the family.
In this country, we can't just accept that face value when a son of a dictator can play with money at a university, at a foundation, at a charity. Oh, he's giving his money. There is, aside from the Kardashians and the Gaddafians, there is another thing, and it's not liberal. Liberal is something completely different. To be a playboy is not liberal. To be a playboy is not to have any morals in that sense of the word. What's happening in Libya is the same, as I said, started originally, was what's happening in Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere in the Arab world and the Third World. And I will follow from your point, David. What we had is fathers pursuing the Beijing consensus and sons pursuing the Washington consensus. Fathers wanting from the top down, army, tribes, hold power, and maybe see how you can do state capitalism. Sons graduating from the West, coming back with ideas of the Washington consensus, opening up the market, opening up the oil industry, opening up everything, privatizing everything, giving it all to the British and the French and the Italians and the Spaniards and the Americans. This,
I wish,
which WikiLeaks described, another fellow ambassador, described as Saif al-Islam's capacity to charm the West at the expense of the Libyan people. That's what he did. That doesn't make him a good guy or a liberal guy or a guy split from his father. That makes him a thug and a son of a dictator. And I'm saying that objectively, not from an opinion point of view, but going through the facts of this guy's being over the last 10, 15 years, I cannot come up with another conclusion other than a son of a dictator like father, like son.
Okay, let's move away from Saif Gaddafi, just because I know there are lots and lots of people waiting for questions. I'm going to come to you, and then to you, Sarah, at the back, and then to these questions here. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Lana, and I'm a freelance journalist. I firmly believe that these uprisings throughout the Arab world are going to lead to a completely different Middle East, and that there's no going back.
Just keep it a bit closer to your mouth.
Okay. I think they've revealed that the Arab people have a sense of justice and a cosmopolitanism that's inherent to their culture. And they've also revealed the historical hypocrisy of the West in its dealings with the Middle East. I think the fact that it's a bottom-up uprising in all of these countries is very important because sorry, this is kind of distracting me. I'll just move on. Can you please comment on the fact that on the one hand, America has finally come around to condemning the dictators, but on the other will not support the condemnation of continued settlement building in Israel, when clearly the zeitgeist has changed and there is no going back from this exposure of Western hypocrisy in its dealings with the Middle East.
Okay, Richard Dalton, as someone who served in Jerusalem and elsewhere in the region, can I ask you to respond to that before we move on to the next question? That this feeling that there should be condemnation of Israel's settlement policy at the same time as support of these democracy movements?
Well, of course there should be, and the American position was idiotic. On the one hand, vetoing the resolution, on the other hand, saying, but of course we do condemn settlement building. I mean, if ever there was a display of weakness in an approach to a major international issue, that was it. I mean, on the broader question of how we progress the Middle East process of non-peace between the Israelis and others, I don't think we really want to get into that now, but my view is that we need to turn ourselves around 100%, chiefly in Israel, but also with the United States.
Okay. Gentleman at the back there.
Steve Somerville, freelance. Would any members of the panel, including our former ambassador, like to give any credit at all to Tony Blair in his dealings in the dark, in the tent, in the desert, in persuading Colonel Gaddafi to dismantle his nuclear program? And the supplementary questions, of course, are, did he ever have a nuclear program, and are there any vestiges of it to our knowledge?
Okay. Did he have a nuclear program?
Yes.
Richard Dalton?
Yes, and the governments involved in that negotiation, British and United States and Libyan, deserve credit. I think the important thing in the history of involvement with Libya is to look back over the slow and steady way in which this change in Libya's international behaviour established itself from the mid-1990s. I won't give you a history lecture, but just register that much press writing about how it all happened all of a sudden in 2003 on the weapons of mass destruction issue is nonsense. And the second thing that's also nonsense is that somehow Tony Blair had a special role. He was one of the last European heads of government to go to Libya.
But one of your colleagues,
course,
Oliver Miles, said he went further than he had to, that essentially the Foreign Office wasn't saying you have to go personally, and he kind of did and decided to go further than others. So
that's not how I remember it. I mean, admittedly I was in Tehran at the time, but the plain fact of the matter is that after the suspension of sanctions in 1999, negotiating with the Libyan government for oil concessions was legal, and it was in the interests of Europe to do that. And that's why everybody did it, why also the United States did it. And the way Libya and other countries work, where there is a heavy political element to trading, is that on the biggest issues, the heads of government need to get involved. Now, it's entirely free to all of us to go to our members of parliament and say, we don't like life if that's what life requires. So please stop it. Don't, David Cameron, go round the world with businessmen in train. That's not your job as our representative. But if that's how you believe, then you've got to use your own democratic system to establish that.
Thank you. I'm going to try and get a few more questions then. I think you had a couple of questions here at the front, and yes. Sorry, we'll take a question there, and then can we get the other microphone to the front row? Thank you.
My name is Sumaya, and I'm a PhD student, and I'm studying in Jazeera, and my question is for you, Marwan, actually. I'm wondering about Egypt and the new role that Egypt might play within Middle Eastern politics. I mean, do you think it's too early to sort of see a sort of stance from Egypt, especially towards Hamas and Israel and Iran?
The question has always been, as we were speaking earlier, it's not who will replace Mubarak, but what will replace the Mubarak regime. Although we have an affirmative on the first question, the second question is still a work in progress.
Yeah.
What will replace the Mubarak regime? Just the last 72 hours, there have been changes. Assets being frozen, ministers being kicked out, prosecutor acting independently, and so on and so forth. So there has been some movement. I think there's two ways of judging what Egypt can do. One, through its dominant role in the Arab world. It can play the role of Brazil in Latin America or the role of China in Asia in a more positive way than China, more like Brazil. Second, through the domino effect, meaning if it happened in Egypt, it will continue to happen there. So even if Libya proves to be a bit more difficult, I think sooner rather than later, they will have to lift the siege of Gaza. Because you can't have freedom for Egyptians and not freedom for Palestinians. Sooner or later, the Israelis are being rattled, and they will have to start respecting the intelligence of the Egyptian people a bit more than they respected Mubarak's intelligence. I think the same thing will happen with the United States, Washington in particular. It will start treating those countries like Egypt and perhaps its new sisters and brothers like Tunisia and so on and so forth, not like clients, but like countries with whom they will have mutual interests and perhaps mutual security, mutual respect, as President Obama put it.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you to pass that microphone to the gentleman here and come to the front row.
Very forged freelance journalist. We've been hearing Gaddafi talking repeatedly about an al-Qaeda threat. What do you make of that? And is it just another lie, or is there something else behind?
Okay, is there an al-Qaeda threat? David Held, do you believe? I'm going to ask all of you briefly for your question. Yeah, Noman?
Yeah,
It's been a very frequent refrain in the last few days.
I think it's as simple as that. You know, first of all, I believe it's baseless statement. And just before that, let's say like 4 weeks ago, everybody knows, and Libya itself, it's proud of itself. It's one of the fewest countries, you know, they get rid of al-Qaeda and all the Islamists. So how come just out of the sudden al-Qaeda appears as of like the driving force behind this? But I would like to put it in a different framework. Now we have a coin with two faces, you know. There's opportunity and there's a threat as well. The opportunity is for the Libyan society, with the help from the West as well, or the international community, to help the Libyans to achieve what they want, which is like open democratic state. So there's, and I think when we talk to the media or talk to the people, this is the message we need to deliver. And when we talk about the other side, I'm not naive to say, no, it's safe. Of course, when you have a chaos, especially the situation now, always there's opportunity for any group like al-Qaeda or others to exploit that vulnerability, especially when you have the AQIM just near, you know, knocking at the doors now. And they've issued many statements, which is crystal clear. We don't need to go through analysis, because, and even I believe they claim false claims when they said 2 days ago, the AQIM, we give orders to Libyans fighting abroad to go and join the battle inside Libya. It doesn't help the Libyans, but just this is what was Colonel Gaddafi using now. So yeah, there is a threat, but I am strongly suggest we don't need to talk about threat to the media, to the people, because it will undermine the Libyan revolution. You know, all the lives being sacrificed the last 2 weeks there, when we start to ignore the main issue there, people protesting outside, looking for freedom, as simple as that, reclaiming their own state, and we turn to start to talk about threat. We need to talk about threat, but behind closed doors. But who is behind the Libyan revolution? It's the Libyan people. It's 100% transparent referendum from the ordinary Libyans.
Lady here, and then I'll come to you.
Jacqueline Peach from AFP News Agency. Gaddafi seems to have a closer ties to sub-Saharan African countries. We hear reports of him arming local tribes, Tuaregs. How does this change the dynamic of this uprising in Libya in comparison to the others that we've seen? And then on a wider question, Egypt, Yemen, Libya, they're all presidents. What happens, what is the likelihood of success of these uprisings in countries where they are essentially going against a ruling family, a royal family?
Okay. The links to sub-Saharan Africa, Richard Alton, was that always there? I mean, he's been, Nelson Mandela actually has in the past called him his friend.
Yes, Nelson Mandela was crucial in persuading Libya to hand over the Lockerbie accused for trial under Scottish justice in the Netherlands in 1999. And if there was to be an attempt to persuade Gaddafi that he should go, then it would have to involve African states. It would have to involve people who Gaddafi may still respect and who, through the African Union, have an institutional connection with him. In the Libyan, I mean, Gaddafi wants a stage, and he decided that he was never going to be able to make it big on the Arab stage after the bad history that so many Arab countries had had with him. So he created an African stage for himself in so doing, reviving the moribund OAU and turning it in a constructive direction through the creation of the African Union. And whereas, while he elicited some resentments for the way in which he tried to strong-arm the African countries, on the whole, it's something that has redounded to his credit in Africa. And the second issue, of course, is that if the hand of a Libyan central authority is weakened for a prolonged period of time, we may get a resumed surge of economic migrants, thinking that this is a good window to go through to get to other territories.
And are there African diplomatic levers that have been worked and pulled in recent days? Noman, is it your understanding? Because I'm just conscious that actually we haven't talked very much about that, and I wonder whether there are initiatives that we've missed.
No, honestly, to be honest with you, I don't think it's the other way around, because this is always like Colonel Gaddafi, how he see it. I don't think like there's Africans, especially the African sub-Sahara, like sharing the borders with Libya. They are in position to influence Colonel Gaddafi's decision, and I can assure to you from now, he will stay in Libya. He will never ever gonna leave. Okay. So, but the most important thing, I think, regarding African sub-Sahara, which is concerned not just the Libyans, even some European countries, the position of the Tuareg there, near Opari and other cities there, because we have two kind of Tuareg there. Some of them, they are Libyans, but there is a vast majority of them, they have no stats. They are not Libyans, but just they have cards, just showing they are Libyans. Now, some of them, they start to evacuate and to leave towards northern Niger and northern Mali. Algeria start to get very angry about that, and it's mobilized part of its army near the border, So I think, if the situation carry on like that, maybe we'll start to see another conflict there.
Okay, and then let's just talk briefly about the second part of your question, which was: is the uprising different in different parts of the world if it's if it's a monarchy essentially, or a ruling family that people are up against? Marwan, does it have a different tone? Jordan, Bahrain.
I started by saying that as much as there are specificities to each case, I do see a common thread. In those republics, it's quite baffling that republics with ruling families, republics with ruling families, there's contradiction in term. But they have absolutely no problem creating inheritance, and for the rule to be divided among the sons, that's the first layer, and then the in-laws and the second layer, and then the tribe or the ethnicity on the third layer, and they call it a republic. So there is something in common in that sense. In the republics, we've seen inherent, whether it's Yemen, they were hoping for it. In Egypt, they were planning for it. In Syria, it's happened. In Libya, of course, it was happening, and so on and so forth. So you have these republics that have created de facto ruling families, not dissimilar from the ruling families in the monarchies. So the monarchies, because they had the real legitimacy of monarchies, were actually more capable, as in Morocco, as in Saudi Arabia, to hold on to power. While the absolute phony republics ruled by pseudo-ruling families, the Qaddafians, for example, of course, were the first of all, because they were so transparently corrupt, so transparently unaccountable, so transparently oppressive, so transparently undemocratic, so transparently unrepublican that they were had to be the first of all.
But we begin to see reform movements in Morocco, of course, you mentioned Jordan, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia. The most extraordinary thing happened just yesterday or the day before, when a significant number of Saudi Arabian intellectuals published a manifesto for constitutional change and constitutional monarchy in Saudi Arabia. I mean, if this is happening in Saudi Arabia now, on the back of this surge of popular movement, I think it's going to go a lot further than we currently anticipate. I think in Morocco, the king has initiated a more liberal regime over the last several years. His position, I think, is relatively secure, but there will be significant constitutional changes on the back of this. But the big changes, of course, that will affect us, everyone thought the Gulf wasn't going to be affected. No one imagined that 1/3 of the Bahraini citizens would be on the street. And now, with this new unprecedented publication of a manifesto for change in Saudi Arabia, it is even possible that these movements will affect Saudi Arabia, which would have enormous repercussions for the West.
Noman, sorry, I just want to get in a couple more questions. You've been waiting.
Yeah, hi, I'm Mark Harrison. Really links into that last question. We've talked about this being referred to as an Arab Spring, and we talked about the social contract, and that these uprisings have happened in countries where there is less transparency and arguably a sort of worse regime. Given the power of social networking that we talked about and satellite media, I'd be interested to hear the panel's thoughts, and especially the former ambassador's thoughts, about how far these social uprisings might well spread. And I guess I'm really talking about different regions, such as Iran here. Given the social tensions and uprisings we've already seen there, do you see this as encouraging renewed social uprising from the ground roots up there, or on the flip side of that, encouraging reform from the top down, which may then have its own lead into revolution again coming up from the bottom, as, say, in the former Soviet Union?
Well, Iran is one of the countries that's been blocking some of the coverage of certainly events in Egypt.
First, a general point. Electronic media facilitates oppression. It facilitates communication once a political movement has begun, and it helps inspire people, yes. But you're constantly trying to keep ahead, if you're organising, of the effect of a police state's ability to use those same tools against you and your fellows. Second point, Iranians, like so many others in the Middle East, have family living in completely different situations from the ones which they're experiencing. They know from annual visits what it's like to live under those polities. So it's not the medium that makes the change to the Arab Spring, because this knowledge has been out there that they've been maltreated and there's a better way of doing things. It's the fall of the barrier of fear. And that has happened as a result of the success of revolutions, beginning with Tunisia. So, yes, I believe that an academic who spoke at Chatham House may be right when he said this means the end of stability, because the barrier of fear is down. Now, in Iran, at present, the forces of the establishment are well ahead of the current of protest and rejection of clerical rule. And short of some tremendous misstep by the authorities, such as major slaughter in a public square of a group of public demonstrations, I think it'll be some time before the barrier of fear comes down far enough to get the people who are shouting on the roofs in anonymity, in the dark, into a more coherent political force. It'll come, but whether it comes in a year or 5 years or 10 years is impossible to say at present.
Okay, David.
Yes, I would just add briefly that the emergence of the IT revolution and of new forms of social communications is just at the beginning of its development. These technologies are only 10, 15 years old, and new implications emerge from them all the time. They clearly have an extraordinary impact on authoritarian regimes, because authoritarian regimes want to control the flow of information. And once you get all these horizontal and network linkages, the capacity for the control of information breaks down. So this has implications for all autocratic regimes, whether they're in the Middle East, Iran, and further into the East. But I should also say it has radical implications to be worked out in the West as well. Our democracies, in many respects, it's not on our topic, I'll just say this, but the implications are not just for autocracies, but are also for the West. Our democracies are relatively stagnant. If the United States is the model, or one of the most advanced models of democracy, it's also it lives with a Congress which is gridlocked, where most critical issues can't find a winning coalition of support to pass them, and this affects everything from climate change to financial market reform. And though the impact of these new technologies on these old democracies, I predict, will be just as significant eventually as the impact on the old autocracies.
I'm going to ask for a closing thought from Noman and Marwan, and then wrap it up.
Yeah, just I'd like to say, first of all, when we talk about the region, we have like officially 22 countries we recognize as the Arab countries, member of the the Arab countries. I'm wondering if anyone like disagree with me. None of them is a democratic modern state. None of them. All of them, they belong to the history. We should be very fair with it. Either we talk about republicans or kingdoms. All of them, in terms of their legitimacy, they belong to the history. But just this is one of the pain we have to deal with as alternative. Otherwise, we have to go to the Iraqi situation or what's going on in Libya. But we have to be clear about these issues if it's real concepts and values we believe in. You know why? Because of one thing, the civic culture, it doesn't exist there. The civic culture. So to build a real civic state, this is first of all I would like to clear about. There's something very significant here about Libya and why the battle of Libya, it's very strategic. You know why? Because what Colonel Gaddafi is doing now, the way how he countered the wave, it's not just Libya. It will affect the entire Middle East because if he succeeds, he will be capable of stopping this wave. It's not going to be peaceful anymore, and it will really, really, I think, affect what's going to happen in Iran and Syria as well. If he managed to turn it to be a civil war and then start to be an international issue or international conflict, I think he will be capable of stopping this wave to be spread as a very peaceful. Some people, they get fed up. They don't accept what's so-called the social contract or a corrupt contract, in terms of like, okay, provide to us security and we accept to live as a subject. This is the situation. So what's going on now, I would like to say, the people, they decide, because all the past experience, it's failed, like Islamists, nationalists, Marxists, all of them, they failed to deliver. Now the people, they decide to go out and claim the nation state.
Okay,
Noman,
thank you. Okay, Marwan, you and I both TV presenters. I know you can do this. You've got 30 seconds to make your closing thoughts. I wouldn't do this to the others, but to you, I think it's fine.
Let's just say I'm very optimistic about what's going on. So I think it is good news.
Yes.
It's good news in the sense that it happened. It's good news in the sense it's work in progress. We are moving in the right direction, but there are no guarantees. And this will be a long way. Actually, the hard work is ahead of us, not behind us.
Yes.
But we are here and we are heading in that direction. It's not simply because there is social media and there is young people suddenly. There is nothing sudden about it. I think we should pay respect due to the hundreds of thousands of Arabs who were tortured, jailed, picketed, demonstrated, went on hunger strike throughout the Arab world, were not reported. Those are the invisible Arabs. The hundreds of thousands, the millions that were displaced by their regimes from Iraq to Morocco. Those that tortured, the prison, the striking, the activists, the young and the old, the men and the women, they're the ones who should be thanked for. And I think in that sense, that's why I am hopeful, that's why I'm optimistic that it's going in the right direction.
Okay. Inshallah. Thank you very much to everyone for being here. Thank you for taking part in this debate. I wish we had more time. And please join me in thanking your panel tonight. Thank you very much.